Happy first Friday of February, Bears. It's kind of a mouthful. Took a little bit of a break in January with our first chapter Fridays, but we're getting back into it in February with some great books each Friday. So this one's called The Parker Inheritance by Varian Johnson. It is a Coretta Scott King Award winner from a couple years ago, and it is a great mystery and history. So a little bit of historical fiction, a little bit of mystery, and just a great story that teaches a little bit about family, friendship, family secrets, and the civil rights movement. So it goes back and forth in time between a girl named Candace and the story of her family from the past as she tries to solve a mystery. So it starts out in chapter 1 with Abigail Caldwell. October 17th, 2007. Abigail Caldwell stared at the letter. The letter stared back. The paper was bright, crisp, smooth, like the pages of a new book that had yet to be cracked open. The letter, with its small, black, single-spaced words and sharp edges, spoke of a great injustice. It was written by a man who did not exist, and it promised an incredible fortune to the city of Lambert, South Carolina, if its puzzle could be solved. Abigail refolded the letter, then placed it in her purse. Dusk was beginning to set, and apart from the handful of teens playing basketball, Vickers Park was empty. She sat on a bench outside of the Enoch Washington Memorial tennis courts. A small crew had already removed the rusted fence surrounding the courts and was now carrying over jackhammers. A large yellow backhoe loomed in the distance. "Miss Caldwell, you sure you want us to start tonight?" the chief of maintenance asked, handing her some earmuffs. "We're going to have to pay overtime, and the noise alone will—" "I know," she said. "I'll deal with any fallout tomorrow." She couldn't risk starting the operation during daylight hours. It would draw too much attention. The chief adjusted his hard hat. "Which court do you want us to start with?" he asked. "That one," she said, pointing to the one on the left. It sat directly across from her park bench, from what she hoped was the final clue. "And it would be mighty helpful if I knew what we were looking for," he said. "I agree, Odell." She rose from the bench. "Maybe a chest? A crate? I don't know, but I'm sure we'll recognize it when we see it." Once the lights had been erected, the crew began jackhammering, breaking up the green tennis court into chunks. Then came the backhoe, its engine groaning through the night. Abigail stood nearby, flashlight in hand, watching as the machine scooped out pile after pile of rubble and dirt. With each dump, she reminded herself of all the clues from the letter, the photos. The money had to be there. The chief paused the backhoe after a few hours, then waved over Abigail. "I'm sorry, Miss Caldwell, but we're not finding anything. How much deeper do you want us to go?" She checked her watch. Time was passing too quickly. It would be dawn soon, and with the sunrise would come a flurry of questions and accusations. "Maybe just a little deeper," she glanced at the bench. "And can you have a few of your guys start jackhammering the base below there, too?" He followed her eyes to where she was looking. "But don't tear up the bench. It's important." He frowned. "But, Miss Caldwell, the work order said we're only supposed to—" "Don't worry about that," she snapped. "I signed the order, and I'll handle any problems with the paperwork." Then she sighed. "I'm sorry. It's just a lot's riding on this." As he went to give new instructions to his crew, she peered into the deep, dark hole. Abigail had wagered her reputation, her job, and perhaps her overall career on a hunch. She hadn't even considered that she could be wrong. A newbie from the Lambert Trader showed up around 4 o'clock that morning, followed by more experienced reporters an hour later. And then, as the sun rose over the park's majestic oak trees, a black sedan pulled up in front of the basketball courts. Abigail was a little surprised the mayor had arrived in person, but then again, he was up for re-election next year. It was probably time for him to make his annual trek to the Vista Heights neighborhood. Abigail checked the small hole where the bench had been, then walked back to the larger hole. She didn't know it yet, but it didn't matter what, if anything, she discovered that morning. The mayor had already suspended her. She would be forced to resign by the end of the day. The letter would remain a mystery, its secrets hidden for 10 more years, until someone came along who was brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough to take up the challenge again. That someone was Abigail's granddaughter. Her name was Candace Miller. So that is chapter 1. And in chapter 2, we meet Candace Miller. And it's 2 years after her grandmother has passed away. After her digging of the tennis courts, it's 2 years later. And Candace has just moved to Lambert, South Carolina from Atlanta. Her parents are recently divorced, and she's not real happy about having to move and leave Atlanta behind. But her dad is living close by, and she and her mom are living in her grandma's old house. So Candace finds out that her grandma had, become known as the crazy lady of Lambert. She had been the first Black and female manager of the city until she had gotten this crazy notion in her head that there was treasure buried somewhere in the city, and insisted that it was true. And then on this fateful night, dug up the tennis court and was fired or forced to resign. So she kind of became the laughing stock of this town, and that's where Candace comes in. So she didn't know this about her grandma, and so she's just learning this now. But as Candace settles into her grandma's old house, she discovers this letter in the attic, and decides to start investigating herself, along with the help of a neighbor boy across the street named Brandon. So as Candace and Brandon race to try to solve the clues in this letter before it's too late and it's forgotten about again, they discover a lot of things about the town's history, some not so nice things about the town's history, forgotten heroes, and learn some things about their own families in the process. There's a great author's note at the back. It's an interview with the author, Varian Johnson. And he talks about how even though it's a fictional book and the characters are fictional, it's partly based on his hometown in South Carolina, where he grew up, and the high school where he went. So a lot of the things that take place in the story, in the past parts of the story, are based on things that he grew up with. And so there's a lot of really interesting history. He talks about a tennis match between a white school and a Black school during the time of segregation. And that is based on a basketball game that took place during that time in 1944 between the North Carolina College for Negroes and the Duke University Medical School team. And it was a secret. There's a whole book written about that. It was a secret basketball game because during segregation, you could go to jail or be punished for playing a segregated game of anything. So that's a really interesting story in itself. But there's a lot of characters introduced, famous baseball players, tennis players who really lived, and they are incorporated into the story. So if you read this book, I encourage you to read the author's notes at the end, because there's a lot of really interesting history about civil rights. All right. So we'll be back next week with another First Chapter Friday. Enjoy your weekend and stay warm. Bye-bye.